Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another Know Your Ship episode. This episode will be about the Fubuki class destroyers that served with the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II. Our story starts during the early 1920s with the demise of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance and the soon-to-be signed Washington Naval Treaty. These series of events actually led to some pretty fascinating developments, most notably in Japanese destroyer designs. Prior to this, Japan had had a naval alliance with Great Britain that dated all the way back to the early 1900s, and this alliance had been renewed a few times. However, when it came up for renewal again in the 1920s, things started to be different. And one of the major contributing reasons to why the alliance was not renewed was that Great Britain at the time saw that the most likely rival to her would actually be the United States, and the US would most likely be the next enemy. And it therefore wanted to avoid situations where it could get dragged into a war with the US. At the same time, Japan, analyzing the world as she saw it, saw that her main enemies most likely would be, in order, the US, Russia, China, and possibly Great Britain. The demise of this naval alliance led the Japanese to realize that Japan could no longer depend on Great Britain for any kind of naval technology or naval assistance, and therefore had to develop her own naval technologies and design her own ships. The Washington Naval Treaty was another contributing factor to the design of the Fubuki class destroyers, since Japan would be inferior in tonnage to both the US and Great Britain when it came to capital ships. Japan needed ships, therefore, to be force multipliers, thereby canceling out the advantage held by the US and Britain. So all of these factors led to the design and construction of the Fubuki class destroyers. The Fubuki class destroyers, when they were first constructed, displaced 1,780 metric ton standard. The ships were 118.41 meters long overall, with a 10.36 meter beam and a 3.2 meter draft. The first two batches of Fubukis, numbers 35 to 54, had 4 boilers, while the third batch of the Akatsuki subclass had only 3, but they were more powerful. They all drove 2 Campbell geared steam turbines producing 50,000 shaft horsepower, giving the Fubukis a maximum speed of 38 knots. Now, I have read some materials that place the initial speed of the Fubukis as 35 knots. However, comparisons with other destroyers from other places in the world with roughly the same displacement and power output all have their speeds closer to 38 knots, which leads me to believe that the initial 38 knot figure that I read is more accurate. The Fubukis were laid down between 1926 to 1930, with ships being completed between March of 1928 to August of 1932. The Akatsuki subclass were laid down in 1930 and completed between August of 1932 and March of 1933. The first batch of Fubukis, numbered 35 to 44, were armed with 6 dual 127mm 50 caliber guns in Type A mounts. The Type A mounts had a maximum elevation of 40 degrees, and the guns were elevated in pairs. The second batch and the Akatsukis were equipped with Type B mounts, which allowed the guns to elevate to a maximum of 75 degrees for both anti-air and anti-surface work. The Type B mounts were the first dual-purpose gun mounts to be equipped on a destroyer anywhere in the world. Furthermore, all the Fubukis were equipped with fully enclosed splinter-proof, gas-proof turrets, which was also among the first of any destroyer in the world. The 127mm guns fired a 23 kilogram projectile with a 7.7 kilogram propellant, with a muzzle velocity of between 910 to 915 meters a second to a max range of 18,400 meters. The guns had a barrel life of between 550 to 700 rounds. Shells consisted of 2 kinds of nose-fuse high-explosive shells, incendiary shrapnel, illumination, and anti-submarine shells. As to the specifics of the anti-submarine shells, I have found no detailed information about them, sadly. The Type B mounts, while technically capable of being an anti-aircraft gun, had poor traverse speeds, managing 4 to 6 degrees per second of traverse and 6 to 12 degrees per second of elevation, which made them rather poor AA guns. The firing cycle took between 6 to 12 seconds, and the gun suffered from somewhat poor dispersion. The Fubukis were all equipped with 3 triple torpedo launchers, the early ships being equipped with the Type 90 torpedoes, although they were switched over to the much more famous Type 93 long-lance torpedoes later on. The Type 90s carried a 375 kilogram explosive charge to 7,000 meters at 46 knots, 10,000 meters at 43 knots, and 15,000 meters at 35 knots. The torpedo weighed in at 2,605 kilograms. The Type 93 long-lance carried a substantially larger 490 kilogram explosive charge out to 15,000 meters at between 48 to 50 knots, 25,000 meters at 40 to 42 knots, and 30,000 meters at 36 to 38 knots. The torpedo weighed a bit more, coming in at 2,700 kilograms. There is debate as to whether or not the Fubukis carry torpedo reloads or not. Personally, the appearance of a rail system near the two amidships torpedo launchers makes me believe that reloads were indeed carried. Furthermore, Japanese torpedo doctrine also suggests at least some reloads were carried, as Japanese destroyers were expected to fire their first torpedo load, disengage, reload in 15 minutes, and come back to fire the second volley. However, sources seem to disagree on this a lot, as I've found some sources that said the Fubukis carried no torpedoes for reloads, 3 torpedoes, 5 torpedoes, 6 torpedoes, and even 9 torpedoes for reloading all the launchers. Finally, the Fubukis were equipped with an ever-increasing amount of 25mm anti-aircraft guns as the threat from the aircraft kept increasing. These guns fired ball, armor-piercing, tracer, white phosphorus, incendiary, and high-explosive incendiary rounds at between 425 to 475 rounds a minute, on paper at least. In actuality, they only managed about 250 rounds a minute. The max range for the AA guns was between 700 to 1500 meters. There were major problems with these AA guns, as they could not be trained fast enough or elevated fast enough to engage fast-moving aircraft. There was also excessive vibration, a large muzzle blast, and way too small of a magazine, which reduced rate of fire. Nevertheless, at the time they entered service, the Fubukis can legitimately be considered some of the most powerful destroyers in the world. Comparatively speaking, the destroyers of the Royal Navy, the US Navy, the Italian and German navies could not compare in terms of gun and torpedo armament. The only destroyers in the world that were comparable would be those of the French Navy. However, their destroyers tended to displace a few hundred to 1,000 tons more. Thus, the Fubukis caused a great stir amongst the world's navies when they first entered service. Furthermore, the Fubukis also increased the comfort for the officers, as they were the first Japanese destroyers to have a fully enclosed bridge area. The belief was that if the officers were kept warm and dry, they would be more alert and efficiency would improve during combat. In addition, keeping the officers sheltered would also improve their health, as open bridges tend to cause a lot of colds, pneumonia, and other health problems from being exposed to the elements. The torpedo control positions were also covered, increasing their serviceability in bad weather and under battle conditions. Still, the Fubukis were not without their problems. The heavy armament and associated fire control systems added quite a lot of top weight onto the ship, which was designed to have the maximum amount of firepower on a hull with the least displacement. This seriously threatened their stability. In addition, the Fubukis also had structural issues, which was shown when the 4th Fleet passed through a very severe typhoon in 1935. Wind speed reached 125 kilometers an hour, and the waves were 15 meters in height. The damage to the fleet was severe. 2 of the Fubuki-class ships, the Hatsuyuki and the Yugiri, had their bow sections broken as far back as the bridge. 8 other destroyers of the Fubuki class suffered cracks, distortions, and other damage to their hull. This is because when Japanese designers designed the ship, they used a wavelength to height ratio of 20. Except during the storm, the height ratio was only 10. This resulted in the situation that whenever the destroyer sagged in the trough of the wave during the typhoon, there would be enormous forces on either the stern or the bow of the ship, which led to plenty of damage. This led to a massive rebuilding of all the Fubuki-class ships. The rebuild occurred between 1935 to 1937. The ships had their hulls reinforced, and excessive top weight was removed to improve stability. The incident, suffered by the 4th Fleet, also caused the Japanese to stop electric welding and return back to riveting. There were steps taken to reduce displacement after all these changes, including reducing stowage of shells for the main guns, removing the original depth charge launchers and replacing them with lighter ones, and reducing torpedo reloads, although do keep in mind the uncertainty about torpedo reloads I mentioned earlier. The displacement of the ships jumped from 1,780 metric tons to over 2,100 metric tons, which drastically reduced the speed of the Fubukis down to between 34 to 35 knots. The Fubuki-class destroyers, including the 4 Akatsuki-class ships, totaled 24 ships in total. Out of these 24 ships, 1 was lost before World War II, 18 of the Fubuki-class were lost during the war, 3 of the Akatsukis were also lost. Out of all the Fubukis, 2 were mined, 3 were lost to surface action against US ships, 1 was sunk by a Dutch torpedo, 5 were sunk by US submarines, and 7 were sunk by aircraft. Out of the 3 Akatsuki losses, 1 would be sunk by surface ships and 2 by submarines. While I won't go over all the ships in the class, I will go over a couple of interesting stories. The Miyuki, for example, was lost before World War II. On June the 29th of 1934, in the Korean Strait, south of Jeju Island, she collided with the Inazuma, one of the Akatsuki-class ships. The collision sunk the Miyuki and tore the bow off the Inazuma. The Miyuki became the only modern Japanese destroyer to have not taken part in World War II, and also the only time a Japanese destroyer was lost in a collision with another Japanese destroyer. The first 2 ships of the Fubuki class to be lost were both lost to Dutch forces not too long after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. While covering the Japanese invasion of British Borneo, the Shinonome came under attack by Dutch military aircraft. Bombs from either a Dornier 24 flying boat or a Martin B-10 bomber hit the aft magazine of the Shinonome, and she blew up with the loss of all hands. A few days later, on the 24th of December, the destroyer Sagiri was torpedoed by the Dutch submarine HNLMS K-16, which resulted in her aft magazine catching fire and exploding. 121 of her crew went down, although 120 survivors were saved. The Dutch submarine herself was sunk a day later by I-166 with the loss of all 36 crew. The Ikazuchi and Inazuma took part in the Second Battle of the Java Sea. During that battle, the HMS Exeter of the Battle of River Plate fame, along with the 2 destroyers HMS Encounter and USS Pope, were sunk. The Ikazuchi, then under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shunsaku Kudo, placed his ship in danger of submarine attack to rescue 442 survivors from the Encounter and Pope. The Inazuma picked up 376 survivors from the Exeter and the Pope. The survivors picked up by the Ikazuchi were treated humanely. They were taken good care of and provided with clean clothes and food. Lieutenant Commander Kudo's honorable decision to pick up survivors when there were no Allied ships in the area and humane treatment of the survivors is sadly overshadowed by the fact that out of the roughly 800 survivors that were picked up on that day, 190 of them would die in captivity in prisoner of war camps. Fubuki took part in a few notable engagements. On the 27th of January 1942, the Fubuki and her convoy was attacked by the destroyers HMS Thanet and HMAS Vampire, about 150 kilometers north of Singapore, in the Battle of Endau. The Fubuki, along with other destroyers in the escort group, sank the HMS Thanet, but overall the Japanese made a rather poor showing in this particular night engagement. The HMAS Vampire managed to escape, and her captain's report about the incompetence of Japanese night fighting capabilities will cause the Allies to vastly underestimate Japanese night fighting capabilities. This would come back to haunt the Allies during the nighttime battle of Savo Island. During the Guadalcanal campaign, the Fubuki undertook a number of sorties into the area, including transport runs as part of the Tokyo Express, and also bombarding U.S. positions on Guadalcanal. On October 11, 1942, in the Second Battle of Savo Island, the Fubuki was part of a naval task force sent in to bombard Henderson Field. The Japanese naval force was surprised by a U.S. force of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers. The Fubuki was spotted by the San Francisco and the Boise around 1,300 meters away, and was absolutely devastated by the cruiser's firepower, which sent her to the bottom. In October of 1942, the Akatsuki was used frequently to ship supplies to Japanese troops as a part of the Tokyo Express transport runs. On the 25th of October 1942, the Akatsuki, along with the Ikazuchi and another Japanese destroyer, made a daylight raid into Iron Bottom Sound. They managed to damage the USS Zane, sink the fleet tug USS Seminole, and the yard patrol craft YP-284. One interesting fact was that the loss of the Seminole and the YP-284 led to the loss of 1 crew member aboard the Seminole and 3 Marine passengers aboard YP-284. This was mostly because the shells fired from the Japanese destroyers passed through the thin skins of the fleet tug and the unarmored wooden sides of YP-284. The Akatsuki and the 2 other Japanese destroyers were driven back by U.S. Marine coastal artillery which managed to hit the number 3 turret on the Akatsuki, killing 4 men. On the evening of the 12th to 13th of November, the Akatsuki took part in the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal as an escort for the Japanese battleships Hiei and Kirishima. This strong Japanese naval task force ran into a task force of U.S. destroyers and cruisers. The Akatsuki illuminated the USS Atlanta, but in doing so attracted the attention of the USS Laffey, O'Bannon, Atlanta, San Francisco, Portland, and Helena. The Akatsuki was hit repeatedly, blew up, and sank within a few minutes with the loss of all but 18 of her crew. The Ayanami was involved in the Second Battle of Guadalcanal, the famous engagement between the South Dakota and the Washington against the Kirishima. The Ayanami was involved in the first phase of the engagement, where Japanese forces were able to inflict heavy losses on U.S. destroyers, sinking the USS Preston, Walk, and mortally wounding the USS Benham, and severely damaging the USS Gwin. However, a little bit later on, the USS Washington would spot the Ayanami and cause critical damage to her during that engagement with the Kirishima. Critically damaged and abandoned, the Ayanami would be scuttled by the Uranami. The Amagiri is notable for being the destroyer that rammed and sank PT-109, which was at the time commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. The commander at the time, Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hananami of the Amagiri, would later attend President Kennedy's inauguration in 1961. The Amagiri was also one of 2 Fubukis to be mined, although it took her well over 2 hours to sink, so there were relatively few fatalities. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode on the Fubuki class destroyers. Hope you all have a really good week, and I look forward to talking to all of you again soon.